April 8th, 1943, 27,000 feet above France. The oxygen mask couldn't hide Oberleutnant Ralph Hermachen's grin as he studied the strange new shapes climbing toward him through the clear blue sky. Sitting in the cockpit of his Focke-Wulf 190A5, the veteran ace of Jagdgeschwader 26 watched the Americans struggle to gain altitude. "The Army has sent us flying milk bottles," he joked to his wingman, laughing at the sight of the massive Republic P-47 Thunderbolts below. 16 of the new fighters from the 4th Fighter Group clawed their way upward, engines roaring, heavy wings steady in tight formation. Each was powered by a 2,000 horsepower Pratt Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engine, a beast of a machine straining under nearly 7 tons of steel and fuel. To the German pilots, the sight was ridiculous. Huge, barrel-shaped fuselages, bubble canopies gleaming, propellers nearly the size of windmills. Compared to the sleek Spitfire or agile Messerschmitt, the Thunderbolt looked slow and overweight, a brute pretending to be a fighter. But appearances deceive. What the Germans were really seeing that morning was the beginning of their own destruction. Within 18 months, these flying milk bottles would become the most feared aircraft in the European sky, a thunderous symbol of American industrial might. Each wing held 4 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, 8 in total, firing over 6,000 rounds per minute. At full burst, they could tear a fighter apart in less than 2 seconds. That morning, Major Donald Blakesley, leading the 335th Fighter Squadron, spotted enemy movement above. A veteran of the Eagle squadrons, Blakesley knew what most of his men didn't yet understand. The P-47 wasn't built to turn with German fighters. It was built to outclimb them, outdive them, and outshoot them. The Thunderbolt was a new kind of machine, a high-altitude powerhouse designed for a different kind of war. Where the Luftwaffe had chosen agility, Republic Aviation had chosen brute strength. Among the 56 American pilots in the air that day were men who would become aces and heroes. But on April 8th, 1943, they were rookies in an untested aircraft facing the most experienced fighter corps on Earth. The Luftwaffe had been at war since 1939. These Americans were fighting their first real battle. What followed wasn't just a clash of aircraft. It was a clash of philosophies. German precision versus American mass production. The story of the Thunderbolt began 3 years earlier in 1940. As German bombers swept across France, Republic Aviation's chief designer, Alexander Kartveli, received urgent orders: build a high-altitude interceptor fast enough to catch the enemy. Kartveli's answer wasn't pretty. "It will be a dinosaur," he said, "but a dinosaur with good proportions." The prototype, XP-47B, flew on May 6, 1941. It shocked everyone. At nearly 10,000 pounds empty, it was heavier than any single-engine fighter in the world. Its turbo supercharger system gave it a humped, muscular look that earned it the nickname Jug, short for Juggernaut. But in the thin air above 25,000 feet, nothing could touch it. The Pratt Whitney R-2800 engine kept full power where others gasped for air. Still, early impressions weren't good. Major Hubert Hub Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, hated it. Between September 1942 and January 1943, his squadron lost 18 pilots and 41 planes in training accidents. The Thunderbolt was temperamental. It rolled on takeoff, spun easily, and dove so fast that its controls locked solid at high speed. Pilots feared it, mechanics cursed it. But those who learned its temperament discovered something astonishing. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a farm boy from Oklahoma, described it best. It was like strapping yourself to a locomotive. The power was unbelievable. You didn't fly it. You aimed it. When the Thunderbolt entered combat, it confirmed the Germans' confidence. It couldn't turn with the Focke-Wulf 190 or climb with the Messerschmitt 109. Luftwaffe pilots toyed with it, attacking from below, forcing turning fights where it stood no chance. Joseph Pips Priller of JG-26 called it meat for the slaughter, and the numbers agreed. 14 Thunderbolts lost for only 3 kills in the first month. British observers joked that the best evasive maneuver in a P-47 is to unstrap and run around the cockpit. But something unexpected happened. The P-47s that came home told a different story. Some had more than 100 bullet holes. One limped back with 21 cannon hits. The giant radial engine refused to quit. Liquid-cooled fighters like the Spitfire or Mustang would have been smoking wrecks. The Thunderbolt just kept flying. Then came the day that changed everything. June 26, 1943. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson found himself under attack by a swarm of FW-190s. His canopy shattered, his engine caught fire, shrapnel tore through his arm. The canopy jammed, he couldn't bail out. Trapped in a burning cockpit, Johnson kept flying. He throttled back, diving for England. A German ace pulled alongside, peppering the helpless Thunderbolt with cannon fire. Johnson braced for the end, but the P-47 refused to die. The German emptied his guns, saluted, and peeled away. Johnson's aircraft, riddled with over 200 holes, landed safely in England. That one flight rewrote the legend. The Germans learned that day what American engineers already suspected. The Thunderbolt could take punishment like no other fighter in history. From that moment, everything changed. Pilots adapted. They stopped turning with the enemy and started diving. The P-47 could hit 550 miles per hour, faster than any German fighter alive. Captain Walker Bud Mahurin perfected the new tactic. Dive hard from altitude, strike with all 8 guns, then climb back out before the enemy could react. 1 pass, 1 kill. No second chances. When those 8 Brownings opened up, the sound was like tearing metal and thunder rolled across the sky. Anything caught in that 6-foot kill zone disintegrated. By the summer of 1943, the Luftwaffe's laughter had vanished. The milk bottle had become the hammer of American airpower, and the men who flew it knew they were holding history in their hands. The Thunderbolt had arrived. By late 1943, the Thunderbolt had become the backbone of the U.S. Army Air Forces in Europe. Every week, the skies over occupied France and Germany thundered with the growl of Pratt Whitney engines. The Luftwaffe, once untouchable, now faced a new kind of enemy, one that refused to play by the old rules of air combat. The P-47 didn't dance with the Germans. It struck like a hammer. Its pilots learned to fight in vertical space, to dive from high above, unleash their firepower, and climb away on raw horsepower alone. They didn't need elegance. They needed results. The 8th Air Force was sending deep penetration bomber raids into the heart of Germany, Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Bremen, Berlin. The flying fortresses needed escorts, and for months they had been dying in staggering numbers. Before the Thunderbolt arrived, the B-17 crews had a cruel saying, "We have no escort beyond the Rhine." But by the end of 1943, the P-47 began changing that. With the addition of external drop tanks, its range stretched farther with each month, first to the Belgian border, then to the Ruhr, and eventually all the way to Berlin. Every mile deeper meant another test of the Jug's endurance. The massive airframe could soak up flak, but navigation errors or fuel leaks could turn any mission into a death sentence. Pilots often crossed the channel knowing they might not have enough gas to come home. Still, they went. The Thunderbolt's presence meant life or death for the bombers. To the men of the 8th Air Force, the sight of that broad-winged fighter sliding into formation beside them meant salvation. By early 1944, the Germans had realized the scale of the threat. They threw everything they had into the defense, FW-190s, Bf-109Gs, even the first experimental jet interceptors. But the Luftwaffe was bleeding pilots faster than it could replace them. Young boys with 40 hours of flight time went up against Americans hardened by a year of combat. The Thunderbolt pilots had learned the secret of survival. Stay fast, stay high, strike first. The 50 caliber Brownings became the Reaper's scythe of the skies. A 2-second burst could vaporize a target. Many Luftwaffe veterans began calling the P-47 the Butcher Bird Killer, a bitter twist on their own Focke-Wulf's nickname. On the ground, the Germans feared it even more. The P-47's power and ruggedness made it the perfect attack aircraft. As Allied armies prepared for the invasion of France, Thunderbolts roamed across the countryside, hunting trains, tanks, and convoys. They carried 500-pound bombs, rockets, and incendiary ammunition that could shred armor and melt steel. Low over the hedgerows of Normandy, they screamed in at 400 miles an hour, releasing hell on anything that moved. To the soldiers on the ground, the roar of the Jug was the sound of victory. When D-Day came on June 6, 1944, the Thunderbolt was everywhere. From dawn until dusk, they pounded German positions along the beaches and roads behind enemy lines. Pilots like Gabreski, Mahurin, Zemke, and Johnson had become household names, the heroes of the air. They led from the front, often flying 3 or 4 sorties a day. The Luftwaffe barely appeared anymore. Its fuel reserves were nearly gone. Its airfields were bombed to rubble. For every German fighter that took off, 5 Thunderbolts were waiting. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe was broken. American fighters dominated the skies from the Channel to the Rhine. When the Allies broke out of Normandy and began the race across France, the P-47s went with them. They destroyed rail lines, convoys, and supply depots. Entire columns of German vehicles vanished in fire and smoke. The Thunderbolt had become the flying artillery of the U.S. Army. General Eisenhower later said, "Without the P-47, the invasion of Europe could not have succeeded." But the war was not over. As the Allies advanced toward Germany, the Luftwaffe tried one last counterattack, the Ardennes offensive, known as the Battle of the Bulge. In December 1944, bad weather grounded most Allied aircraft for days. German tanks and infantry surged through the snow, threatening to split the Allied line. When the skies finally cleared, the Thunderbolts came back with vengeance. They cut off roads, smashed bridges, and turned frozen valleys into graveyards of metal. Pilots described it as hunting season. Nothing moved without drawing fire. By the time the battle ended, the P-47 had flown over 30,000 sorties in just 3 weeks. The German army would never recover. By 1945, the Thunderbolt was the dominant American fighter in Europe. It had destroyed more enemy aircraft in the air than any other U.S. plane, and 10 times as many on the ground. It was credited with over 7,000 enemy kills, a number that spoke to both its firepower and its reliability. More than half of America's top aces had scored at least some of their victories in the jug. And unlike most fighters, the Thunderbolt was loved by its pilots not for its grace, but for its loyalty. It brought them home. When the European War finally ended in May 1945, the Thunderbolt's work wasn't done. Across the Pacific, another war still raged, one fought in jungles, over islands, and across endless stretches of ocean. There, too, the Thunderbolt found its place. The U.S. Army Air Forces introduced a new variant, the P-47N, with extended wings and greater fuel capacity. It was built for range, 2,000 miles of it, enough to escort B-29 superfortresses deep into Japanese territory. The Pacific skies were different. The enemies were smaller, faster, and more agile. The Japanese Zero could outturn the P-47 easily, but it couldn't survive a hit from its guns. Pilots adapted again. They used their altitude advantage, dived at 500 miles an hour, and unleashed blinding storms of 50 caliber fire. The Thunderbolt's bulk, once mocked, became its strength. It could absorb flak, survive near misses from anti-aircraft guns, and still return to base on a single working cylinder. From Saipan and Guam to Okinawa and the Philippines, the P-47 earned a new reputation, not just as a fighter, but as the best ground attack aircraft in the Pacific theater. It strafed airfields, ships, and supply depots. It crushed resistance on Iwo Jima and covered the B-29 raids on Tokyo. In the final months of the war, when fuel was scarce and targets few, Thunderbolt pilots roamed the skies over Japan with near impunity. Their enemies had no answer. The end came swiftly after the atomic bombings. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Thunderbolts filled the airfields of the Pacific, lined up wingtip to wingtip under the tropical sun. For many of the men who had flown them through 2 years of hell, it was the end of an era. They had survived because of that machine, the juggernaut, the flying bulldog that had never let them down. After the war, the P-47's story didn't fade. Thousands were rebuilt and sent to new homes across the world. They served with air forces from Latin America to Eastern Europe. In the early years of the Cold War, before jets took over, the Thunderbolt was still a familiar sight. Its reliability and ruggedness made it ideal for nations that couldn't yet afford modern aircraft. Even in civilian hands, a few survived. Warbirds maintained by collectors who remembered what that deep, thunderous growl once meant. In all, over 15,000 Thunderbolts were built, more than any other American fighter of the war. They consumed more aluminum, more fuel, and more firepower than any single-engine plane in history. But every pound was earned. In return, they gave Allied airmen the freedom of the skies. To this day, historians debate whether the Mustang or the Thunderbolt was the better fighter. The Mustang had grace, speed, and range. The Thunderbolt had raw strength, durability, and firepower. But in truth, the war needed both. The Mustang won the long-range battles. The Thunderbolt won everything else. It broke the back of the Luftwaffe, crushed enemy logistics, and gave ground troops the air support they had only dreamed of. To those who flew it, the P-47 was more than an aircraft. It was a companion. Pilots spoke of its loyalty, its refusal to die, its unshakable presence when everything else went wrong. They trusted it with their lives, and it delivered. When peace came, the roar of the Jug faded from the skies. But in museums and air shows, that sound still echoes, the deep, throaty rumble of a 2,000 horsepower radial engine rising into a roar that once meant victory. The P-47 Thunderbolt had been mocked, underestimated, and nearly discarded, yet it became one of the most powerful symbols of American air power ever built. And in the end, history proved the truth. When the war ended, most men just wanted to go home. But for the pilots of the Thunderbolt, leaving their aircraft behind felt like parting with an old friend. Many had walked out of wrecks that should have killed them, and they all knew the Jug had saved their lives more than once. Across Europe and the Pacific, pilots took last photos beside their machines, hands resting on dented cowls and scorched fuselages. Each scar told a story of a flak burst that didn't kill, of tracer rounds that didn't ignite, of missions that ended with a rough landing instead of a funeral. In the immediate aftermath of victory, the U.S. Army Air Forces faced a simple problem. The jet age had arrived. Engineers were already testing aircraft that could break the sound barrier. The Thunderbolt, for all its achievements, was a relic of piston-driven war. Yet its design lessons would become blueprints for the future. Republic Aviation, the company behind the P-47, was already sketching its successor before Germany surrendered. They called it the XP-72. Essentially a super Thunderbolt with a 28-cylinder engine and a top speed near 500 miles per hour. It was monstrous, even by wartime standards, but technology was moving faster than anyone expected. Jet engines promised simpler designs, higher altitudes, and more speed than any propeller could give, so the XP-72 never reached combat. Still, its engineering lineage flowed directly into Republic's next project, the F-84 Thunderjet, one of the first operational U.S. jet fighters. The Thunder name would live on through generations. Thunderjet, Thunderstreak, Shikai Thunderchief, and finally the A-10 Thunderbolt II, a direct nod to the old P-47 that had done so much with so little. Pilots who transitioned to jets noticed the difference immediately. Jets were sleek but fragile, fast but temperamental. They didn't forgive mistakes. Many veterans missed the solid, unbreakable feel of the Jug. One pilot described the first time he flew a jet, it felt like flying a soap bubble after wrestling a bulldog. That comparison captured what made the P-47 special. It was heavy, loud, and hard to break. The post-war years saw the Thunderbolts scattered around the globe. Hundreds were shipped to Allied nations rebuilding their air forces. France used them in Indochina. Brazil flew them on long patrols along the Amazon. Mexico, Turkey, Italy, and Yugoslavia all adopted surplus Thunderbolts, training a new generation of pilots on a design that could still outfight anything prop-driven. In Latin America, they remained in service into the early 1960s. In some countries, they even flew combat missions against insurgent forces, decades after their first flight. While jets were glamorous, the Jug remained practical. Maintenance crews loved its simplicity. Mechanics could swap an engine in hours and patch bullet holes with tin and rivets. That toughness kept it flying long after newer designs had retired. The Thunderbolt was not just a warplane, it was an engineering triumph of survivability. Engineers studying its airframe in the 1950s realized how advanced it had been for its time. The P-47 structure was massively overbuilt by design. Its thick wings could carry bombs, fuel tanks, and rockets without bending. The elliptical cross-section of the fuselage gave the aircraft a natural aerodynamic efficiency, despite its size. Its huge radial engine wasn't elegant, but it was safe. Liquid-cooled fighters like the P-51 often went down from a single bullet through the radiator. The P-47 just kept flying. That redundancy, that ability to take punishment and still perform, became a defining principle in post-war American aircraft design. When the U.S. Air Force was established as a separate branch in 1947, many of its leaders were Thunderbolt veterans. They carried forward a philosophy shaped by the JUG: build for reliability first, performance second. That mindset produced aircraft like the F-86 Sabre, the B-52 Stratofortress, and later the A-10 Thunderbolt II, all famous for their durability. In a very real sense, the P-47's DNA can still be found in America's most successful combat aircraft. But even as the jets took over, the stories of the men who flew the JUG kept its legend alive. Francis "Gabby" Gabreski, America's top Thunderbolt ace, ended the war with 28 kills. After a brief civilian stint, he went back into uniform to fly jets in Korea, scoring more victories and proving that skill, not just technology, wins air battles. Robert S. Johnson, another ace, became a test pilot and author, his memoir Thunderbolt, immortalizing what it felt like to duel in a 15,000-pound fighter over Europe. Pilots like Walker, Bud Mahurin, David Schilling, and Hubert Zemke became living legends, symbols of a generation that had gone from near defeat in 1942 to total dominance by 1945. Zemke's Wolfpack, the 56th Fighter Group, became the most famous of them all. Its pilots scored more than 665 aerial victories, more than any other U.S. fighter group in the European theater. Their motto, "To the last man," summed up both their spirit and the Thunderbolt's reputation. Zemke himself once said, "If I had to fly combat tomorrow, I'd want a P-47 under me." Stories from the field became aviation folklore. One Thunderbolt returned to base with half its tail missing. Another limped home with an entire cylinder head blown off, oil pouring down its sides. A third survived a mid-air collision with a German bomber. The JUG lost a wingtip but still landed safely. Mechanics kept souvenirs: bent propellers, smashed gun barrels, fragments of flak that hadn't made it through the armor. These relics told a truth that statistics alone could not. Even the enemy respected it. German pilots often reported frustration fighting the P-47. Its dive speed made it almost impossible to chase. Many Luftwaffe veterans recalled how terrifying it was to face a swarm of Thunderbolts strafing their airfields. One German ace said simply, "We could fight the Mustangs. We could not stop the Thunderbolts." As historians revisited the war decades later, they began to recognize how the JUG had shaped Allied strategy. The P-47 gave commanders something they had never had before: flexible, on-call firepower that could hit any target within hours. It bridged the gap between air superiority and ground attack. That versatility became the foundation of modern airpower doctrine. The A-10's close air support mission, the use of multi-role fighters, and even the concept of air interdiction all trace their roots to Thunderbolt operations in Europe. Technically, the Thunderbolt was also a pioneer in aerodynamics. Its turbo supercharger system, a complex network of ducts running through the fuselage, was years ahead of its time. It allowed the engine to maintain full power at high altitudes, giving the JUG unmatched performance above 25,000 feet. The system's complexity demanded precision manufacturing, but it laid the groundwork for post-war understanding of forced induction and high-altitude flight. Later jet designers borrowed its airflow principles when developing compressor stages and cooling systems. In the 1960s and 1970s, as warbird preservation began, the P-47 became a prized restoration project. Its sheer size and engine power made it expensive to operate, but enthusiasts valued it as the pinnacle of piston engine engineering. Museums across the United States, from the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum to smaller regional hangars, restored Thunderbolts to flying condition. The sound of a R-2800 engine starting up became a time machine to another era. Veterans who had not seen or heard one in decades often wept when that deep rumble returned. By the late 20th century, fewer than 24 Thunderbolts remained airworthy, but their symbolic weight only grew. Every summer, at air shows in Oshkosh, Duxford, and Chino, the JUG still flies. Its wings catch the sunlight, its engine shakes the ground, and for a few minutes, spectators understand why pilots once called it indestructible. Engineering students continue to study the P-47 for lessons in structural resilience. Its wing loading, airflow management, and center of gravity balance demonstrate how brute force and smart design can coexist. It was not efficient by modern standards, but it was foolproof. In an age obsessed with speed and stealth, the Jug's philosophy, survive first, then strike, remains relevant. In combat history, the Thunderbolt also changed perceptions of what made a good fighter. Before the war, most nations believed agility and lightness mattered most. The P-47 proved that power, altitude, and durability could dominate. That insight shaped the heavy jet interceptors of the 1950s and 1960s. Planes like the F-100 Super Sabre and F-105 Thunder Chief owed their existence to lessons first learned in the Jug. The Thunderbolt's story is also a story of industry. Built in huge numbers at Republic's Farmingdale plant on Long Island and under license by Curtiss in Buffalo, the P-47 represented American manufacturing at full power. Assembly lines turned out one aircraft every 90 minutes at peak production. Thousands of women worked as riveters, welders, and inspectors. For them, the Jug was not just a machine of war. It was proof that American industry could outproduce any enemy. When the war ended, that same industrial might turned to peace, building cars, appliances, and homes for returning veterans. The Thunderbolt had trained an entire nation in precision manufacturing. Today, when the A-10 Thunderbolt II flies close air support missions, its nickname Warthog echoes the Jug's reputation. It, too, is ugly, tough, and loved by its pilots. It, too, was nearly canceled by bureaucrats who didn't understand its purpose. And like its ancestor, it endures because nothing else can replace it. The lineage is direct: a big gun, a big engine, armor thick enough to come home. In military academies, instructors still reference the P-47 when teaching the principles of air dominance. They use it to illustrate the trade-off between performance and survivability, the role of logistics in aircraft design, and the psychological impact of air power on ground forces. The Jug remains a case study in how engineering choices shape strategy. By the dawn of the 21st century, few living pilots remained who had fought in Thunderbolts. Yet their memoirs, interviews, and footage keep the machine alive in collective memory. Documentaries and films often credit the P-51 Mustang as the glamour star of the war. But among historians and airmen, respect for the P-47 runs deeper. It was the unsung workhorse, the one that carried the fight from the beaches to Berlin and beyond. Standing beside a preserved Thunderbolt today, one realizes its sheer size. Over 10 tons fully loaded, more than 36 feet long, and with wings broader than many twin-engine aircraft, it defies the stereotype of a nimble fighter. Yet the design works, every curve purposeful, every inch of metal serving strength or airflow. It is a sculpture of power, not beauty, and that is precisely what makes it compelling. When that massive propeller spins up and the R-2800 coughs to life, the sound rolls like thunder across the field. The same sound that once shook the skies over Normandy, over the Ardennes, over Tokyo Bay. It reminds listeners that technology changes, but courage and engineering excellence do not. In the end, the P-47 Thunderbolt stands as one of the most successful combat aircraft ever built. It destroyed more enemy aircraft in the air and on the ground than any other American fighter of World War II. It gave birth to a design lineage that still defines close air support philosophy, and it symbolized the industrial and human resolve that turned the tide of the war. History sometimes forgets the giants because they lack glamour. The Thunderbolt was never sleek or graceful, but it did its job brutally, efficiently, and without fail. Its pilots trusted it with their lives, and it earned that trust 1,000 times over. When the last Jug finally lifts off the runway at an air show, banking slowly into the blue, its roar carries an echo of everything it once meant: freedom, resilience, and unyielding strength. The world may have moved on to stealth and supersonic flight, but the spirit of the Thunderbolt still flies. And somewhere in that thunder, you can still hear the promise it made to every pilot who ever strapped in: I'll bring you home.